Father Gerald Murray and Robert Royal are up next, but first a little news to share with you. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the retired Roman Catholic Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has been removed from public ministry and faces further punishment over abuse allegations. Pope Francis ordered the 87-year-old cardinal's removal, pending further action after the Archdiocese of New York found credible and substantiated allegations that he sexually abused a high school-aged altar boy on 2 occasions when he was a priest some 40 years ago. Cardinal McCarrick, the Washington Archbishop from 2000 to 2006, is one of the highest-ranking U.S. church officials accused of sexual abuse to date. Here with analysis is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here and for making the trip, taking the time. We have a lot to get to, including there's a lot of back and forth this week, as you heard earlier with Newt Gingrich, about immigration. The Bishops' Conference last week issued a very strong statement saying that this policy of separating families is immoral. It should go no further. This reflects, of course, the papal thinking on this as well. We'll get to those comments later. Bishop Edward Weisenberger of Tucson rose on the floor of the Bishops' Conference. They were having their meeting down in Florida. And, well, he offered this, asking about canonical penalties for border enforcement agents. Watch.
In light of the canonical penalties that are there for life issues, I'm simply asking the question if perhaps our Canonical Affairs Committee could give recommendations, at least to those of us who are border bishops, on the possibility of canonical penalties for Catholics who are involved in this. And therefore, for the salvation of these people's souls, maybe it's time for us to look at canonical penalties.
Father Jerry, your reaction?
I was surprised, Raymond, when I heard that, because canonical penalties apply to crimes that you commit according to canon law. And working for the border agency is not a crime. Enforcing the United States law is not a crime. You can question the justice of the law, but the remedy for that is advocacy and try and convince the legislature to change it. You can have different points of view on this question of family separation. You know, you can look at from the point of view of saying, it's regrettable that parents and kids are separated at the border, but you can also say, why are parents trying to bring kids in illegally? Don't they know there's a risk that that might happen? So, I would not counsel at all even looking at the subject of canonical penalties, because people doing their jobs conscientiously are not committing any canonical crime.
Yeah, well, they would say this is an unjust law, and as you've heard, some of the hyperbolic language, this is like the people working at DACA or the people enforcing segregation. This is inherently evil.
No, it's not, because if someone commits a crime and they happen to have children, the children are not allowed in the jail cell with them. They're separated. People should know that if they break the law, there are consequences. Now, if people want to have open immigration, they can argue that point of view, but you can't say to the border agent, you have to agree with my point of view and ignore U.S. law when called upon to carry out your duties. And by the way, we're a humane people. These children are being put in circumstances where they're trying to be helped. And, you know, I don't consider this any way near a criminal activity by the border agent. That's wrong.
Robert Royal, give me a sense. There is this tension between the horrible images we saw of family separation, children being, you know, crying and upset as their parents are taken away or they're separated from them, and enforcement of the border. And it seems that because of the way the law and the rulings from Judge Dolly G, from that 1997 Flores decision, it requires that you release kids after 20 days of detention, and you can't keep families together. She shut down Judge Dolly G, all the family detention units in 2015. So how do you keep families together and enforce the border?
Yeah, there's no question that this is a complicated issue. Now, what we can say, I think in large terms, is no one likes the idea of innocent children. There are a lot of cases where there are not parents trying to bring children in. Something like 13-14% are,
according to Reuters.
Yeah, they may be coyotes, they may be being trafficked or whatnot. But look, 70% of the American people say they don't like children being separated from their parents, and I think that's exactly right. By the same token, though, because of the difficulties that immigration has caused, not only in this country, but we see it all around the world, something like 70% of Americans also want to see a zero-tolerance policy on immigration. So they want strict border enforcement, but not harsh penalties toward children.
Yeah.
Now, that said, how you negotiate this, in my judgment, after decades here in Washington, government is a very blunt instrument. And so you see it in a case like this, where what you're trying to do something that's kind of sophisticated, and it's not all that easy to craft the legislation, and it's perhaps even harder to get Congress to move on something like this.
Right.
So we're going to be, I think it's important to debate this. It's important to be as humane as we can be. And I actually have a certain amount of trust in the border agents themselves, many of whom are Hispanic themselves, and know the concrete situation better than most of us.
No, well, look, as I said earlier, I was just at the border. You talk to these agents, they deal with the human misery every day. I also, one of these agents, he pulled up in the back of his car, he had a pile of toys, new toys, in the back of his car. I said, what are those for? He said, oh, a bunch of agents and I got together because we take that down to the facility here where the kids, you know, it's sort of the refugee resettlement center where the kids are. They bring toys to them, and they do that themselves. No agency is doing that. The government isn't doing it. They're doing it out of the kindness of their own hearts. But I think one of the things lost in all of this, and the demonization of people on both sides of this debate, and social media, what's being lost is we are dealing with human lives, and some of these children are being trafficked. And if it's 13% of every family unit, so a child with an adult presenting themselves at the border or crossing the border illegally, if 13% of them are not parents or true guardians, isn't it in the best interest of those children to vet every case and not just take them at their word? We can't as a government do that in the interest of caring for these children. That's my sense of this. And that, I don't think that's draconian. Naturally, we have to treat them humanely on this side of the border, as well as hopefully in their native country. But what is the obligation? Where does this fall on the line of moral teaching in the church, Father? If you had to put abortion at one end and everything else after it, where would immigration policy fall?
No, immigration is how we treat our fellow human beings, and particularly cases of people who are coming here for various reasons. But a nation has a right, according to the Catechism, to regulate immigration and to regulate who gets into the country under what circumstances. So having borders is not an offense against other nations. Now, how it's handled is a political decision. So like, as Bob says, you know, Washington can be a very convoluted place. We all want good outcomes. We do not like children being separated from their parents. But the message to the parents on the other side of the border is, don't try and get in here illegally with your children, because you're going to risk being separated from them. It may be for a brief period of time. And we do have to be concerned precisely that this is not being used for illegal purposes of trafficking children into this country.
Well, on that number that the Homeland Security Secretary exposed this week, that of the 12,000 children in government care, the United States government care, 10,000 of those children came alone. They were unaccompanied minors who were either trafficked into the country or simply sent across the border by themselves.
Yeah, you know, I'd also like to add that on this moral continuum that you're talking about, look, we have an immigration policy. We allow 1 million people into the country legally every year. So people who are trying to break the law and get in, sure, I mean, we understand they're coming from terrible circumstances. In some cases, it's just economic opportunities that they're seeking. But we have a legal policy that's quite generous. It's not as if it's just impossible to get into the country. My wife is an immigrant and talks often about her family having to wait 7 years and finding a sponsor here. And she gets a little bit frustrated with people who jump the line. I mean, there's also that moral dimension as well. So it's a complicated issue, but we don't, I think you're quite right that we don't want to just talk about this in slogans. There are human lives involved here in a variety of different ways.
Right, and there are many considerations, and it's a complex thing because of the laws on the books, the precedent, as well as the laws passed here in Congress. And all of that has to be negotiated as we talk through this. But we'll see where this lands, but I do think keeping the security and to protect children in the forefront has to be an obligation. And speaking of that, a terrible story this week. This statement from the Archdiocese of New York from Cardinal Dolan, I'll put it up on the screen for you. The Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, at the direction of Pope Francis, has instructed Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, instructed him that he is no longer to exercise publicly his priestly ministry. Cardinal McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Newark, the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has been stripped of authority owing to a 47-year-old sex abuse claim against him. put forward by a minor, now a man in his 60s. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it's been corroborated. That's
Right.
the other thing. That
Substantiated.
they determined that it was a credible charge, and then it was corroborated. I don't know, they haven't put out the details because they're trying to keep confidentiality in these circumstances. The worrisome thing about this is, let's put this bluntly, everyone knew about Cardinal McCarrick. I've been here in Washington 30 years doing public Catholicism.
There were a lot of stories floating
and these
around.
stories have been floating around. No one knew exactly, what to do about it. Very few of us are in a situation where we could actually do something about this.
Yeah.
And very few people were willing to go on the record.
But some apparently did go to Rome.
However, we know because of the recent statements that have been made, that when he was Bishop of Metuchen and when he was Archbishop of Newark, that there were charges against him and settlements.
Yeah, let me read the statement. I want both of you to react to this. This is from the Bishop Cecchio from the Diocese of Metuchen. I can report to you that there has never been any report or allegation that Cardinal McCarrick ever abused any minor during his time here in Metuchen. In the past, there have been allegations that he engaged in sexual behavior with adults. This diocese and the Archdiocese of Newark received 3 allegations of sexual misconduct with adults decades ago. 2 of these allegations resulted in settlements. What does that tell you?
We have a problem here, Raymond, and this is a problem that goes beyond just this incident of sexual abuse. By the way, it was of a seminarian, a high school seminarian. The abuse took place at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1971 and 72 in the sacristy. As this young seminarian was being prepared to serve Mass, we know that because the lawyer for the victim went public with this. Now, that relationship, of course, is of a man of great power, a priest over a seminarian. So we have an abuse of authority that it was committed. Right. Now we have these 2 charges or these cases where the settlements were given. I want to know a few things. Were the people who brought the charges seminarians or priests of those dioceses? Did McCarrick, Cardinal McCarrick or Archbishop McCarrick have any relationship of authority over those people? Because that's abuse of authority in addition to immoral behavior. What are we talking about here? Payoffs? Who made the payments?
And when?
The settlements, when were they made? And by the way, were there any demands for confidentiality and not going public with the way when these settlements were made? If what the Weinstein case shows, if you own a company and then the company pays off a victim of your sexual depredation, that's a complete abuse of the purpose of that company and of the victim and all the rest. We're talking the Catholic Church here. Now, for Cardinal McCarrick to do, having done these things, is of course immoral, but then for the Catholic Church to pay off victims and not reveal it at the time, I think it would be of interest, for instance, if they were priests or seminarians, that the people in Washington, where he served as Archbishop, would know that their bishop had done this thing in the past, but we never knew that at the time.
Robert Roy.
Yeah, I think that this is a very big network that is going to have to be explored. Several people, Rod Dreher, now an ex-Catholic because he was so disgusted with what he found when he started to dig into these cases, and he had dug into the McCarrick case as well, says that there's a large network, and this is not the only case of what's happened here. I think that we've learned, not only here in the United States, but as we've seen in Chile and some other parts of the world, people who've had contact with the cardinal when he was an archbishop, not only going back 47 years, but I think that there are more recent things that they have to be queried about what they knew and when, and did they do anything about this? We are in a very different world than we were, say, 50 years ago. Right. That when discoveries like this take place, we know that there are consequences that go on for decades. Yeah. And just as in the Harvey Weinstein case or some of these other cases that we've been seeing, some of them involve same-sex attractions too. I think we have to say this has to be looked in very carefully because it goes to the credibility of the church at this point in history. We know what a neutron bomb it was that went off in 2002 when the Boston Globe first revealed these abuse cases. This points toward a number of other things that are going to have to be dealt with and cleaned out.
I want to read the Cardinal McCarrick's statement. He said this: "While I have absolutely no recollection of this reported abuse and believe in my innocence, I am sorry for the pain the person who brought the charges has gone through, as well as the scandal such charges cause our people." Unpack that for me, Father.
This is completely unsatisfactory. Earlier in his statement, he said he claims his innocence.
Right.
Then he says, I have no recollection of something. Now, wait a minute. If you said the incident never happened, because you can only claim innocence if you said I didn't do it, how would you recollect the fact that something would have happened, you never did it? Secondly, he says he believes in his innocence. I know I'm innocent if I don't do something. It's not a question of belief. He's sorry for the pain. If he's an innocent man, this victim, he would call him a so-called victim, is inflicting pain on him and on the rest of the church by impugning the reputation of a cardinal. Cardinal McCarrick, the statement I find completely inadequate. If the charges are true, and McCarrick knows they're true, if in fact...
well, he wouldn't have been stripped. He wouldn't have been stripped of public ministry.
That's the judgment of the church.
Right,
but if McCarrick knows that he did these things and that this 67-year-old man, who was a seminarian in high school at the time, actually suffered from him, he should admit it, rather than these convoluted ways. This is an unsatisfactory way to handle this. I'm very upset by that.
Bill Donahue at the Catholic League said, when you look at the timeline of this happened a long time ago. We know that. He said this is not a case of pedophilia, but homosexuality. Your thoughts?
Well, look, as we know from the John Jay report, most of the instances of priestly abuse were not pedophilia. Most people have the impression of young children, 5 or 6 years old. They tended to be adolescents, say from about 12 to 16, and this seminarian appears to have been 16 years old when this happened. So there's a homosexual component to this, but I agree with Father. I think that for his own sake, let alone for the sake of the church, but for his own sake, Cardinal McCarrick should just come clean. If he did this, confess it, express regret, and then go on and ask for God's mercy.
I need to move on to some other topics, including, and again, we're talking about young people. There's a synod on young people coming up in October, where the church has listened. We covered the preparatory document of that, where they brought people from all over the world, young people, including atheists, Muslims, Catholic-believing young people. And again, young people is like up to 30, 35 years old. So they're not little kids. But the intention of this document and the forthcoming synod is to recognize the reality of young people today, to interpret the meaning of that reality, and to choose paths for the church to go forward. So they want to kind of analyze the situation. Now, the document, and in this preparatory document, the term LGBT appears. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender appears. Some are hailing this as an advancement for the church and an embrace, if you will, of gay rights and recognizing gay individuals. Why is that a problem?
This is a big problem. We do not use the political language of the gay rights and associated movement when analyzing the nature of man and the nature of sin. The Catholic Church does not accept that there is a category of human beings created by God meant to commit homosexual activity. We don't believe that bisexual people exist in the sense of saying God made certain people who he wants to have sex with, both men and women. We do not believe in transgenderism. The Catholic Church does not teach that God made some people women but gave them a male body, and therefore they have to discover that they're women by overcoming their male body. We don't believe in any of that. That's a political propaganda term. Using that in this document signals an agreement that all of those categories exist as natural and God-given categories of people. Big mistake.
Robert Royal, I'm sure many of the folks at the Vatican are going to say, but this is the language of the culture and the young people that we're now talking to. Cardinal Baldisseri, who is the secretary of this synod, was asked about it this week. Here's what he said. I'll put it up on the screen. They, meaning the young people who we consulted with, they provided a document and we quoted it. This is the explanation for the inclusion of the term LGBT. Now, reporters have reviewed that original document that the young people submitted. LGBT does not appear in that document. What's happening here?
Well, as you recall, I was there during that week that the 303 young people were there. And, I have to say, I felt somewhat ambivalent because on the one hand, some of them were very enthusiastic and great kids. On the other hand...
And wholly good kids.
Yeah, and on the other hand, it was clear that some kind of modern ideology was starting to seep in, perhaps induced by figures within the Vatican rather than by the students themselves. Now, look, of course we know that young people are constantly confronted with the general culture, as we all are, which inevitably is going to involve this LGBT terminology. But just as with the Synod on the Family, a lot of us looked at the preparatory documents for that as well, and there's this sort of B- sociology that goes on, where you start with the terminology and the understanding that's out there in the culture. And of course, it's very difficult when you start on the other guy's field to score on Catholicism. You know, you're playing their game. It's an away game that you're playing. So I detect the same sort of thing going on here. Now, you know, perhaps people mean well by including this. You know, this is something that has to be confronted, and in fact, it does have to be confronted. But to start using the language of the culture does not bode well for what the consequences will be.
Okay, we'll keep monitoring this. Before we run out of time, I've got to do this. The Pope, in an interview with Reuters, suggested that he first learned about that dubia, the 4 cardinals who proposed questions to him about the last synod, about the exhortation with marriage and what he intended by creating an opening that would grant communion to divorced and remarried Catholics without an annulment. They wanted clarification on that. The Pope says he learned about this dubia from reading the newspaper, and that this is a way of doing things that is, let us say, not ecclesial. Father.
Well, I regret to say that the historical record will not support the Pope's recollection on this, because it's quite clear, and Cardinal Burke has said it, and Cardinal Müller has also said it in these last days, that this material, the dubia, were given to the Pope personally by Cardinal Caffarra, delivered to his office, and also delivered to Cardinal Müller, 2 months before it was in the newspaper. So yeah, if the Pope's mail is intercepted and he's not reading it, then he's got a problem that he has to deal with in his staff. Cardinal Müller should now be asked, did you get that letter 2 months ahead of time, as Cardinal Burke says Caffarra did? I think the Pope here doesn't want to talk about the dubia because obviously he never answered them. And I would counsel him, as a priest who supports and prays for him and for the papacy, it's not in your interest, Holy Father, to ignore the Cardinal's dubia and then to minimize it by saying, this was a newspaper story and that's not how I want cardinals communicating with me. They didn't communicate with you through the newspaper, Holy Father. The record will speak for itself.
Robert.
Look, as we know, these 4 cardinals are sterling men, and they follow the rules. They're committed to Catholicism, and what they did was, in their understanding, what you do when the Pope raises a certain number of questions. They present these things to him privately. Now, I think what the Pope meant to say, and you know, we keep waiting for there to be a correction out of the Vatican about this, perhaps what he meant to say was, he felt that this was a not an ecclesial way of going, because he felt that he'd been contradicted or he'd been criticized.
Or challenged, yeah.
But the simple chronology of this just makes no sense. And if there's a problem here, if he misspoke, then fine, then come out and say that. But I think Father is exactly right about this. It beggars belief, even if that letter never made its way up from the residence to him personally, it beggars belief that someone in those 2 months, probably Cardinal Müller, did not have a conversation with him about the dubia.
I need to quick react to a couple of comments the Pope made over the weekend, very quickly. He said, it is painful to say this. This was at a Saturday audience. People speak of varied families, of various kinds of family. The family as man and woman in the image of God is the only one. This really wasn't widely reported, but he said it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he was meeting with an Italian family group, and it was very encouraging because there's so much propaganda now saying that there's more than one type of family, that 2 people of the same sex who adopt a child can be considered a family. The Church doesn't teach that. The family is Adam and Eve and then their children, and then the rest of humanity follows suit. The Pope also talked about abortion as being the kind of activity that Nazis used. I mean, so the Pope obviously saying things that the Catholic Church has always taught, and it's very encouraging because there are a lot of voices out there nowadays who are trying to say, what Catholics teach about man, woman, and child, that's passé. The Pope is saying, no, that's the truth.
Robert Royal, I want you to react to this very quickly. He also, in that interview with Reuters, he said, let me be clear in these things. He was asked about immigration policy in the United States, and he said, I respect the Bishops' Conference. It is not just about Trump. The governments of the past also pursued policies like this. There was already a problem. He said, I believe that you cannot reject people who arrive. You have to receive them, help them, look after them, accompany them, and then see where to put them. But throughout all of Europe, he says, this is going on.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, what he said there is that populism is not the proper response to the refugee and the immigration problem. Now, in political philosophy, there are various definitions of what we're at right now: populism, or something else, revolt of the masses, or whatever. But look, the reality we have to face is that people in Europe and in North America, Australia, New Zealand, feel that immigration is overwhelming their cultures. This is why I said earlier that 70% of the people in the United States want no exceptions on the border enforcement. What's happened in a variety of places, Italy is most notably the case where now there's been a kind of a Trumpian revolution even in Italy. You have 50% youth unemployment, and you have thousands of people arriving every week down in Sicily or in other places in the south of Italy. The society is simply unable to absorb this sorts of thing. And then other countries feel a threat to their ways of life. So, look, we understand what he's trying to say. It is a good idea to try to take care of immigrants and refugees globally.
And the church's focus has to be, and his focus has to be on humanity and caring for people. Right. And the church does that, is doing that, and should do that here in the United States. They are not Border Patrol. Right. And that's why it's perfectly within the rights of the church to welcome immigrants, feed them at soup kitchens, support them, which parishes in your archdiocese here in Washington do.
Of course.
That is the proper role of the church and appropriate for the church to act in.
Yes, but I would add...
But that's different from national policy.
Yeah, I mean, national policies, each individual country is simply going to have to make a decision about this because, look, politicians are responsible. The Holy Father believes in democratic procedures. Politicians are responsible to their people, and their people say, look, we feel that we're being overwhelmed here. We feel like we're being squeezed out in certain directions. I think that has to be taken into account in policy.
Thank you. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you both for being here. You can follow Robert and Father Jerry's columns at thecatholicthing.org.